Is the Europe we thought we knew? Is it fundamentally changing? Are we looking at shifts that, go way deeper than just the daily news cycle?
That's really the big question hanging in the air, isn't it? And it's at the heart of this deep dive today.
We're unpacking some, frankly, quite provocative ideas. These come from the political scientist Dr. Guéraud.
Mm-hmm. Based on an interview she gave discussing her recent book, Changing Times. It was on the Neutrality Studies YouTube channel.
Right. And our mission here is to explore her core argument. This idea that we're witnessing a decline, a sort of saying goodbye, as she puts it.
Saying goodbye to reason, to democracy, maybe even to Europe itself.
Yeah, exactly. We'll look at the examples she uses, especially focusing on Germany, and then get into her, well, pretty radical vision for Europe's future place.
And this is really for you, the listener, to help navigate these complex, sometimes challenging ideas. Think of it as a way to quickly grasp what might be happening beneath the surface in Europe.
Okay, then. Let's unpack this. Where do we start? Germany.
Let's start with Germany, yeah. So the source material, Dr. Guéraud's perspective, it paints a picture that's, well, pretty concerning.
Okay.
Her main worry seems to be that Germany is undergoing some kind of fundamental change. She talks about a shrinking space for public opinion, for citizen rights.
And she gives a specific example, right? Something quite startling.
She does. The case of two German citizens, Alina Lipp and Thomas Ruppe. They're journalists based in Moscow.
Okay.
They reported on the Ukraine war, visited the territories involved.
And because of that reporting.
According to the source, they ended up on an EU sanction list.
Right. And the consequence.
Denied entry back into Germany, their own country.
Wow. So effectively barred from home without any legal process.
Exactly. That's the crucial point she highlights. This happened without a court decision, without a judge. It was framed purely as an executive decision.
By the EU.
By the EU, yeah. The source links it to figures like Kaya Kallas and suggests the 27 member states kind of nodded it through.
And Guéraud sees this as a test case, a trial balloon.
That's the term used, yeah. A new tool operating outside the established rule of law, which she finds scary.
Scary because of the precedent it sets.
Precisely. And she makes a historical comparison here to really stress the gravity. She says using executive power this way is not far from what Adolf Hitler did, declaring things legal or illegal just by decree.
Okay, that's a very strong comparison.
It is. And we need to be really clear. This is her comparison from the source. It seems intended to highlight the mechanism, the executive action bypassing legal checks, which she finds deeply concerning regardless of the specific context.
Understood. It's about the how, not necessarily a direct equivalence of the what.
Exactly. And it's not just abstract. The source describes a real feeling on the ground in Germany, especially among critical voices, a worry.
Like, could I be next?
Yeah. Will my rights be withdrawn just for reporting something? That kind of fear?
And she argues this is a break from Germany's own identity.
A betrayal of its past, is how she puts it. A departure from the post-war narrative of being a European law-based country that protects civil rights.
Contrasting it with the Germany she remembers after '89.
Right. A Germany focused on peace, Franco-German relations, building bridges to Russia. A different kind of democratic posture.
And this isn't just political theory. It connects to a feeling among citizens now, even with things like inflation going on.
Yeah, while economic issues are there, the source really emphasizes this weird situation, this chilling effect, people feeling they better not say what you really think.
Unsensitive topics. Ukraine, Israel, corona response.
Exactly, those kinds of things. A pressure to self-censor.
Which links to another term she uses, lawfare.
Yes, lawfare. Using legal or quasi-legal means to target critical voices, kind of cutting them off from the mainstream discussion, the opinion corridors.
And this involves state institutions. There was a point about the Constitutional Protection Agency.
The Verfassungsschutz, yeah. The source suggests a perception, at least among critics, that it's now more focused on controlling citizens than protecting the Constitution itself.
How would that work in practice?
Well, she argues there's a blurring of lines. Criticize the government, and you might be accused of criticizing the state.
And then?
Then you can be framed as an enemy of the state, someone who must be prosecuted. She sees this merging of concepts as a way to shut down dissent.
Creating a sense that the law isn't fixed, but malleable.
Yeah, like it exists only as long as you need it. You use it when it suits, you bypass it when it doesn't. The source describes this as a kind of toolbox mentality among some elites.
Like Ursula von der Leyen is mentioned in that context.
Yes, using laws selectively as needed.
Okay, so that covers the internal picture in Germany, according to Giro. What about Germany's external role? There are points about post-Cold War treaties.
Right, moving outwards now, big concerns are raised in the source about Germany potentially acting in ways that breach the 2+4 treaties.
From 1989-1990. The ones that basically set the terms for German reunification and sovereignty.
Those are the ones, foundational agreements. And the source gives examples of potential breaches.
Such as?
Well, one is the whole debate around German weapons deliveries, specifically things like Taurus missiles.
Because they can reach Moscow.
Exactly. The concern highlighted is that allowing weapons launched from German territory to hit targets deep in Russia could be seen as aggression, potentially violating the treaties.
So the location of the launch is key there. What else?
Army size. The source mentions the current defense minister aiming for 460,000 troops.
Which is higher than the treaty limit.
Significantly higher. The cap in the 2+4 treaties was 370,000.
That's a clear difference. Any other points?
Nuclear weapons. The presence of reportedly at least 20 U.S. nuclear warheads in Germany under NATO sharing agreements.
And the treaties
Prohibited Germany from producing or possessing nuclear weapons. So this is also cited as a potential breach.
So the overall picture from the source regarding these treaties is pretty grim.
Yeah, the phrasing used is stark. These agreements are falling apart in front of our eyes.
And unlikely to return.
Probably won't return, is the conclusion cited, suggesting a real fundamental shift in Germany's strategic position and its adherence to those post-Cold War commitments.
This sense of fundamental change, it's not just at the elite level, is it? The source talks about societal splits, too.
Deep splits, yeah, especially highlighting criticism coming from the East, the former GDR.
Why from the East particularly? What's the reasoning given?
It's quite interesting. The argument is that former GDR citizens have such like a feeling for what is happening.
Because they've seen something similar before.
Kind of. That experience of official narratives on TV, the talking heads, maybe not matching their own perceived reality, feeling you weren't allowed to trust your own eyes. It creates a certain sensitivity, apparently.
And this shows up in politics.
The source points to electoral maps. You can literally see the split, East versus West. The East leaning more towards populist parties like the IFD, the West more towards traditional parties like the CDU.
So old protest energy finding a new channel.
That's the argument. Former socialist protest morphing into populist protest. There's even an anecdote mentioned about dark jokes in the former GDR, people saying they almost want the anti-fascist wall back because they don't like what the West is becoming.
Wow. That really captures a sense of disillusionment.
It does. And this critique isn't just about Germany. Giro extends it to the EU itself.
Arguing the EU is also changing, despite its origins?
Yeah, developing what she terms para-authoritarian structures, even though it started as a peace project.
What examples does the source give for the EU level?
Things like the European Digital Service Act, seen as having significant control elements. Also, allegations of election interference, mentioning Romania specifically.
And something about NATO alignment.
Yes. What the source calls a nuancization of the EU. Basically, trying to get EU membership and NATO membership to line up more closely. Finland and Sweden joining NATO are given as examples of this trend.
So a tighter link between the EU and NATO agendas.
That seems to be the interpretation. The overall view presented is that the EU, much like Germany in her analysis, is turning sour, infringing on its own rules and legal foundations. She calls it a tragedy.
And again, there's an East-West dimension here within the EU.
Interestingly, yes. The source notes that leaders from former Eastern Bloc countries, Orban in Hungary, Fico in Slovakia are mentioned, seem much more alerted to these perceived EU infringements.
Because of their own national histories with authoritarianism.
That's the suggestion. Their past experiences make them more sensitive to these kinds of shifts at the EU level.
Okay, let's broaden out now. Her book has these sections, saying goodbye to different things. The first is reason.
Chapter 1, yeah. Saying goodbye to reason. And this is less about specific politics, more about underlying societal shifts.
What are the key factors driving this, according to her?
She points to things like digitalization, the rise of control mechanisms, bureaucracy, but also a kind of generational gap.
A gap in how people process information or discourse?
Something like that. But a major focus is her critique of what she calls science, or maybe more accurately, scientism.
Scientism.
Meaning?
Her argument is that, particularly in public debates like around corona or climate change, science has become overly focused on just figures and numbers, on models.
And the problem with that is,
According to the source, it loses the ability to grasp the world beyond the quantitative. You cannot put everything in numbers. A model isn't the whole reality.
so she's questioning if this narrow model-driven approach is actually reasonable.
Exactly. Is it holistic? Does it capture the full picture? And she links this directly back to the corona period in Germany.
With the Kerr-Anker example.
Right. Kerr-Anker originally meant lateral thinker, something positive. But during corona, she argues, it was turned into an insult.
For anyone questioning the official scientific narrative.
Pretty much. Anyone asking critical questions about the science. The source states this kind of denunciation was very, very obvious in Germany then.
So her point is we're losing a more traditional approach to science.
Yes. One based on curiosity, questioning, falsification. The idea that the figures might not be the final answer. Losing that, she suggests, is a kind of civilizatory rupture. It damages our ability to actually understand the world.
And this loss of reason, in her view, creates the conditions for the next loss, the loss of democracy.
That's the connection she makes. Chapter 2. Saying goodbye to democracy. The loss of reason is the societal bedrock crumbling, which allows democracy to weaken.
What does democracy need, in her view? What's being lost?
It needs citizens who are smart and awakened and sovereign.
So-
People who think critically, who fight for their rights.
But she sees the modern citizen as less engaged.
Yeah, there's a critique about people being glued to phones, losing touch with haptic experiences, with the physical world,
Right.
potentially making them more passive.
And this loops back to that conformist pressure we talked about in Germany.
Directly. That feeling of, you better don't say this. She argues this pressure cooker environment creates a par totalitarian structure. When you silence people, that's the end of democracy, in her view.
There's also a point in the source about elites equating democracy with themselves.
Yes, the idea that the ruling class starts to see itself as synonymous with democracy.
What's the example given for that?
The source uses an incident with Keir Starmer in the UK. His car was vandalized, and he immediately called it an attack on democracy.
And Garrow found that odd. Why?
According to the source, she found it totally weird because you could interpret the act differently.
How so?
Well, maybe it wasn't an attack on democracy, but a protest against what the person saw as his betrayal of people's interests. It's flipping the official narrative.
This seems to lead into another core concept she uses. Civic warfare and stasis.
Yes, drawing on the philosopher Giorgio Agamben. Stasis means society kind of freezing, coagulating into two opposing poles.
Liberal versus populist.
That's the dynamic she describes, and she uses a term from Bruno Amatlo, the bloc bourgeois.
The bloc bourgeois.
Who are they?
It describes the ruling class becoming ever more oligarchic, kind of walling itself off, petrifying itself against the people. And crucially, this bloc identifies itself as the democracy.
And uses its power against the other side.
Exactly. They use lawfare, those legal maneuvers we discussed, against those they label as threats to democracy, namely the populists.
So populists become the designated internal enemy.
That seems to be the core idea. Because, as the source puts it, Western societies are trying to keep the populist parties out, mentioning the FPR in Austria, Le Pen in France, Trump, the IFD in Germany.
So lawfare is deployed against them specifically.
Yes, challenging candidates, lawsuits, trying to get parties banned, these kinds of actions.
And Garrow's argument is that this actually radicalizes the mainstream parties doing it.
That's a key point. She argues the center parties, by using these tactics to exclude populists, become totally extremized and totally radicalized themselves.
It's interesting. The interviewer in the source actually pushed back a bit on the term populism itself.
Yeah, asking if it's just become a convenient label for liberals to dismiss Democrats they don't like.
How does Garrow respond to that?
Her perspective, as presented, is that historically, populist wasn't necessarily negative. She mentions the 19th century Socialist International, focused on improving people's lives, education. That was populist in a sense.
This connects to another idea mentioned from Bruno Amble again about the political spectrum changing, not left-right anymore.
Exactly. Amable's argument, cited in the source, is that it's become up and down, a vertical split. The ruling bourgeois bloc versus the people below.
An oligarchy versus the rest.
Essentially, yeah, a cemented ruling class versus the people. And the source argues this is happening across the West.
And then there's this concept of the people gets real, referencing Philip Lepines.
Right. The idea is that the people is often just an abstract concept in political theory, citizens voting. But in moments like now, the people gets real. By being physically present in the streets, protesting, their voices getting louder, often through these populist movements, they step out of abstraction and become a tangible force.
And this confrontation, people versus oligarchy, is described theoretically as a preform of civil war.
That's the term used in the source, yes, in theoretical terms.
Yeah.
And it's linked back to practical changes, like laws in Germany reportedly being altered to allow internal use of the army in exception situations.
Okay, so if we tie this all together, what's Garreau's main thesis about how democracy is being lost?
Her central argument is quite provocative. She claims the liberal ruling class isn't just reacting to threats, but actively creating enemies.
Two enemies.
Yes. One internal, the populists, like the AfD, and one external, Russia. And the purpose of creating these perceived threats, she argues, is to justify shrinking democratic space.
So they shrink democracy to defend democracy.
Exactly, which she calls a complete perversion. She argues the extremized center is doing this out of fear of losing ground, blaming populists instead of looking at their own policies.
Which brings us logically to the third chapter, saying goodbye to Europe. How does the loss of reason and democracy inside countries connect to Europe's global role?
It's a fairly direct link in her argument. If European countries and the EU structure itself are cracking internally, becoming less reasonable, less democratic,
then Europe loses its standing in the world.
right, it has no more place for Europe in the world, or at least its place becomes very uncertain, a very difficult sort of assessment.
And she acknowledges Europe's relative size.
Oh, yeah. She points out Europe is tiny, 500 million people compared to giants like China. But she critiques what she sees as lingering European arrogance.
Arrogance in what sense?
The belief held by many Europeans, she suggests, that Europe is still the center of everything, clinging to phrases like rule-based order, we are the West, defending freedom and liberty.
The kind of language used by EU leaders like von der Leyen.
Yes, which the source, reporting Garreau's view, bluntly calls basically bullshit.
Harsh. But does she see any counter-movement? Any hope?
She does mention a critical mass that seems to be emerging.
Within Europe?
Yes, across different countries, Italy, France, Germany are mentioned. People connecting, wanting a different kind of Europe. This group feels oppressed. Their voices maybe not loud yet, but building.
And the end of her book is framed as an offer.
A discourse offer, yeah.
Yeah.
Aimed at the global community, places like South Africa, Brazil, Russia, Arab countries, even parts of America.
What's the first part of the message?
Basically, hey, notice us. There are critical voices inside Europe that disagree with current EU policy. Don't equate all Europeans with the EU.
Okay, point taken. And the second message, her alternative vision.
This is where it gets really interesting. It's based on her interpretation of a very old map of Europe from 1534.
A map. How does that work?
The map depicts Europe as a queen or princess, Madame Europe. And the first detail she focuses on is where her feet are.
Where are they?
They stand on Russian body soil, on Russia.
Her interpretation.
That Europe is fundamentally grounded on Russia. It cannot stand, cannot be whole without that connection. She then asks, rhetorically, is it reasonable today to draw a hardcore NATO border right through the middle of that?
And just to clarify, standing on Russian soil here means?
Anchoring, finding its foundation, a sense of common ground, not military invasion, obviously. That clarification is made.
Okay, what's the next detail from the map?
Spain is depicted as the head of Madame Europe, and it's looking towards the Arabic world.
The interpretation being?
Europe needs to look east and south, towards the Orient. It needs that reflection, that cultural exchange. European culture didn't arise in isolation. The implication is, stop twisting Europe's neck to only look west, across the Atlantic to Washington.
Makes sense. And the third detail, something Europe is holding.
Yes, the Reichsapfel, the imperial orb, a golden apple.
What does that represent for her?
She interprets it as the Republic, res publica, the common good. She points out it was translated as commonwealth in the 17th century, meaning citizens creating wealth together for the common good, not the British Empire sense.
So potentially a different economic model implied too, not just political.
Yes. She argues the Republic represents a different economic order than capitalism, focused on the common good.
So putting it all together, her vision for Europe's future involves what?
3 things, based on this map interpretation. Find the Republic again, meaning focus on common good, maybe move beyond capitalism. Look towards the Arabic world, east and south. and stand or anchor on Russian soil, reconnect with Russia.
This sounds like a very different Europe than the current trajectory.
Absolutely. She calls it a continental Europe or a Eurasian Europe, distinct from the transatlantic Europe dominated by the U.S. relationship.
She talks about a distinct European culture, too.
Yeah, arguing it's different from American culture. She uses contrasts like Zafredo Cafe versus Starbucks or European filmmakers like Pasolini versus Hollywood blockbusters.
And she feels this message resonates outside Europe.
Apparently, yes. She mentioned positive reactions from Americans and Turks she spoke with. Her hope seems to be making this offer. If Europe shifted course in this way, would others in the East, in the South, reach out a hand to cooperate?
It's a powerful, if unconventional, vision. So, finally, where does she think we are now in this whole process? Has Europe hit the iceberg she warns about?
Her answer is blunt. Yes, Europe has hit the iceberg.
Already hit it, not just heading towards it.
Already hit it, and since long, as the source quotes her.
Wow. When did you pinpoint the collision?
For her, the key moment the iceberg strike was the banking crisis around 2008, 2009.
Why the banking crisis specifically? How does she analyze that?
She sees it fundamentally as a war of capital against labor, and she makes a striking claim about the political left in response.
What's lame?
That the traditional left essentially gave up resisting globalization and oligarchy after that crisis, became, in her words, a woke left without Keith, effectively shifting rightwards.
And the energy of resistance went elsewhere.
Yes, it shifted, she argues, to a right-wing peoples-based resistance against that bourgeois bloc we talked about earlier.
She draws another historical parallel here, doesn't she?
She does, again emphasizing it's for analytical comparison, not equating things directly. She compares the 2008-2009 crisis preceding these shifts to the 1929 Wall Street crash preceding the rise of National Socialism.
Highlighting the potential for financial crises to trigger major political upheaval.
That seems to be the point. And she argues that after the 2008 crisis, social protests like the Yellow Vests in France started being framed differently.
How so?
They increasingly got labeled as right-wing protest, which in certain circles made them less socially acceptable than if they'd been seen as purely economic or left-wing.
Okay, so if we've already hit the iceberg, according to her, what's the takeaway? What should people do?
Her conclusion is pretty stark. Prepare for the rescue boats.
Meaning, give up on this ship.
Essentially, yeah. Focus on building alternatives outside the existing sinking structures.
What kind of alternatives does she mention?
Things like practical organizing. A trans-European peace project and manifesto europeanpicro.eu is mentioned. An upcoming proclamation related to Gaza on October 7th. Various peace conferences.
So, grassroots cross-border initiatives.
Exactly. She describes it as a potential cross-national uprising against institutions driving policies people don't want.
Does she hold out any hope for reforming the current EU?
Based on the source, not really. Her view is reported as quite pessimistic. The EU is too calcified, there's nothing to reform, no chance, any decent chance of fixing it from within.
So the focus has to be entirely on the alternatives.
Yes. Thinking about totally different European structures, a different security architecture for the continent, something fundamentally new needs to be built.
Well, you've just gone on quite a deep dive with us into some incredibly provocative and frankly unsettling ideas about where Europe might be heading.
Dr. Ulrike Guerreau's perspective, as we've unpacked it from the source material, certainly offers a sharp critique. Germany, the EU, deeper societal shifts.
Yeah, this idea of losing reason, losing democracy, it's heavy stuff. And her vision for the future, drawing on that old map, it's definitely challenging.
It pushes against conventional thinking, offers a stark warning, but also suggests these quite radical alternatives.
So as you mull this over, consider this idea. Could Europe's path forward, at least according to this viewpoint, lie not in doubling down on current alliances, but in a fundamental re-anchoring?
Looking east and south again, revisiting that idea of the republic, the common good, embracing connections that seem to have been pushed aside. What would it really mean in today's world for Europe to metaphorically stand on Russian soil or look intently towards the Arabic world? That's certainly something to think about.